Hello and welcome to Republican Roundtable. As we wrap up the session in Minnesota at our House and Senate, we are now getting into policies, and it may not sound like the most fun topic at all times, but this will relate to many of our viewers. In fact, I think all of our viewers. I'd like to welcome Isaac Orr, Policy Fellow at the American Experiment.
That's right.
And Energy and Environmental Policy, correct?
Yep, that's my specialty.
Welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Yeah, tell us about yourself.
Yeah, so my name's Isaac Orr. I'm a policy fellow at Center of the American Experiment. It's a long name, so we say American Experiment. It is a it's a nonprofit think tank located in Golden Valley, Minnesota. So we're a conservative think tank, and I think it's been around since I've been watching Sesame Street. So it's kind of an institution at this point, right? So I handle there's been a lot of things happening at the Capitol as it relates to energy production and how we use it. And it's my job to kind of dig into that and figure out, okay, is this going to be good or bad for the state, and how do we communicate that to people? Because, as we know, elections have consequences. So
Yep.
how do we inform the electorate about the consequences of the policies that are being elected now that the election went the way that it did?
And unfortunately, we're about to see those consequences in Minnesota after this session with the runaway Democrats, it looks like.
Yeah, it's been a historic session, to say the least.
Exactly. That's kind of my fear coming up here, but hopefully we can turn the tide coming up. But now your specialty, your experience and expertise is in energy and environmental policy. How did you get into that?
Well, I grew up on a dairy farm in Wisconsin, so I grew up in the same house my grandpa was born in.
Cool.
So in 1930, he was born in my sister's room, basically, right? And during the summertime, it would get hot, and the cows would just drink the water level down in our house so much, the well pressure, that we didn't have any water pressure in the house. So I'd get done doing chores, and then all of a sudden I can't take a shower afterward. So when I was in my environmental geology class in college, we were talking about well pressure, groundwater tables and all of that. I'm like, oh, this is very interesting. So I always had the idea that I was going to be a poli-sci major at college, but I also wanted to do geology after that. So I worked for the Heartland Institute for about 3 or 4 years doing energy and environmental policy for them. After a brief stint in the Wisconsin State Capitol, I worked there during 2011 when there were all the protests about the Walker administration. So that was a fun time to be there. I kind of felt like a Forrest Gump moment, you just happened to be at the right place at the right time. But in 2018, I started working at Center of the American Experiment, and I've been there ever since.
Cool. And your tie is with cows today, it looks like.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. I had to pay homage to my dairy farm roots.
And geology is a great study. My mom studied earth science and geology, so
Very
I grew
cool.
up in kind of that world of the science, geology, earth science, and I love that, but probably not as much about water pressure, more about earth.
Sure, yeah, and really I think that background has really helped me explain to people, just convey to them science in a way that is digestible and understandable, because my friend Abby is a mechanical engineer, and she has this joke, it's her favorite joke. She said, what's an engineer's most effective form of birth control? Their personality.
Believe that.
So, one of the things that happens is when people send in maybe people who are really good technical experts, but they're not good communicators to talk about things like science or electricity policy, people's eyes just glaze over, and you don't really resonate with the audience. So I feel like I'm kind of a translator in some ways. So that's what I hope to do this evening on the show, talk about the things that have been happening at the Capitol, and what's good, what's bad, how can we improve it, and yeah, that's it.
And we're getting right into your area with energy and environmental policy. The runaway Democrats, what have they been doing at the Minnesota Capitol this season?
Oh man, what haven't they been doing at the Capitol this season? So they kind of kicked things off with a bang in regards to energy and environmental policy. Their big thing is they wanted to pass a bill that required 100% of Minnesota's electricity come from carbon-free resources, right? So that could be nuclear power, but they actually see it as a wind, solar, and battery storage mandate, right? So it's actually illegal to build new nuclear power plants in the state of Minnesota. It's been illegal since the early 90s, right? So one of the things that we tried to do at American Experiment was we understood that they had the votes, right? They won the election, so they get to call the shots. That's how our system works, right? But how can we make this bill less bad moving forward? And one of the things we really focused on was lifting the moratorium on building new nuclear power plants, because nuclear power plants are some of the most efficient plants that we have in the entire world. So if we're going to do this policy, the carbon-free policy, which we think is going to be really expensive no matter what, so maybe it's misguided. But let's do it in the smartest way possible and not the dumbest way possible. And they said, no, we're going to do it in the worst way possible. So my colleague Mitch Rolling and I wrote a report about this last September, kind of a warning sign, right? And we found that the carbon-free electricity policy is going to cost something along the lines of $313 billion through 2050, which means every Minnesota electricity customer, so that you have your residential customers like you and me, you've got commercial customers like grocery stores, hair salons, that sort of thing, and industrial customers, which are large manufacturers, right? So the iron mines up north consume like 8% of the state's electricity. They use more electricity than the state of Minneapolis, right? It is a huge amount of power that you need to, make Minnesota the leader in mining for the United States in terms of iron ore. So they're going to see their annual costs go up by almost $4,000 a year, every single year through 2050. So residential customers are only going to pay only $1,600 more every year for the same electricity that they're already purchasing. But you're going to pay for it everywhere because the grocery store is going to have to raise prices. So essentially, this is a stealthy way to make inflation worse. And unfortunately, they don't see it that way. They like to pretend that wind and solar they always say wind and solar are the cheapest forms of energy. But that really falls apart because it's all about delivering electricity. Like the most important thing to know about electricity is it's consumed at the second that it's generated, right? So think about what happens when you unplug a light. The light goes out instantly, the power's gone, right? And you have to be able to balance the grid, right? So you have to have, it's like a teeter-totter, right? And it's got to be balanced. So if the demand for electricity goes up as people wake up in the morning, make their coffee, whatever, right? The supply of electricity has to go up in concert with that, at the exact nanosecond, right? So that's really easy if you have a coal plant, a natural gas plant, or a nuclear plant because they're all reliable. But a wind turbine or a solar panel is dependent on the weather. So wind turbines only work about 30% of the time in Minnesota. That's the latest federal data. And solar panels only work about 18 to 20% of the time, right?
So and is that in Minnesota alone?
Yeah. So these are Minnesota-specific figures from federal government data. So the vast majority of the time, we are relying on some sort of other, backup generator to do the job, right? So think about what would happen, and that increases cost because you have basically two systems that you need to run. So I like to say, think about it like you have a babysitter for your kid, right? One babysitter shows up all the time, right when you need them, right? And maybe they charge $10 an hour. You've got another babysitter that only charges $5 an hour, but maybe they show up and maybe they don't. If you want to go and take your wife out for a nice dinner, you need to make sure that you have the $10 babysitter there because you need to know that your kids are going to be taken care of. So what we're essentially doing is we are mandating that the $5 babysitter must be included along with the $10 babysitter, and now we're paying $15. So that's why our electricity prices continue to go up, and we see these large manufacturing companies like Gerdau Steel moving and leaving the state, partially because our electricity prices are so high, and that's going to get worse moving forward because of the blackout bill, which is what we called this.
And that's having to do with blackouts during January, during time when we don't have much sun in Minnesota.
Yeah, exactly. So one of the things that is the big problem here is we are going to become too dependent on wind and solar to show up when we need them most, and that's not a good plan, right? I grew up on a farm, so I know the worst part about growing up on a farm and being a farmer is depending on the weather. I can't tell you how many times my grandparents were like, man, we could really use a rain right now, right?
Yep.
So what we see in California is the sun starts to set right when people are coming home and they want to turn on their air conditioners, charge their electric vehicles, and there isn't enough power on the grid because they've shut down too many gas plants. So the California grid operator actually tells people, please do not charge the electric vehicle that we're only going to allow you to buy in 2035. It was like 2 days after Governor Newsom said, we are not going to sell internal combustion engine vehicles, new ones, in California after 2035, that they said, oh no, please don't charge them right now. We need to avoid blackouts. So this is it's a real problem. And
it is.
It was not taken seriously at all by the Democrats during the session. So Senator Andrew Matthews, he represents Becker, which
Okay.
has a large coal facility, and he's been really good on energy issues. And he offered some amendments that said, hey, if there's a blackout as a result of this legislation, let's just suspend the enforcement of it until we can figure out a way to keep the lights on while also achieving these goals. They said no. They voted it down on a party line. They would not adopt that amendment. And he also had amendments in the bill pertaining to cost, right? So if it gets too expensive, we need to have an off-ramp. So the media pretends that there's these off-ramps, but there is zero objective way to trigger that off-ramp, right? So they say, well, you know, a utility can go to the Public Utilities Commission, which is the 5-member board that governs electricity prices and basically controls what the electric companies do, because one of the big things that
people
need to realize in Minnesota, we don't have private companies for electricity,
Yeah.
right? Xcel Energy is kind of a private company, but they're also a government-approved monopoly. So they have the exclusive right to sell electricity in their service territory. So it would be unfair to let them charge whatever they wanted for power because they have a legal monopoly, right? So the cost of electricity is actually governed by the Public Utilities Commission. It's established by a formula. And I'm not going to get boring, I promise, but this is called the cost of service formula. So it basically says the company can charge enough for electricity to make its money back whenever it builds something new,
Yeah.
plus a 10% return on profit. So that can be a coal plant, a natural gas plant, a new corporate office, or wind turbine, solar panel, right? So that gives the utility, so they have to go to the Public Utilities Commission. That's where we were going. I forgot for a second. But the Public Utilities Commission has to say, yes, you can retire your coal plant, or no, you can't. Or yes, you can build all these wind turbines, or no, you can't. They're all appointed by Governor Walz. So they're all in the tank for this stuff.
Of course.
So there really is no accountability. There's one Republican in name only commissioner on the Public Utilities Commission, and I wish that he would fight harder on a lot of these issues, but unfortunately a lot of times he kind of just goes along to get along, I think. Yeah, we're in a really bad spot, and it's going to undermine the reliability of the grid in Minnesota, and that's going to bring down the rest of the people in the regional electric grid along with us. So I call it the blue state blackout blues.
And I mean, that's going to affect everyone. That's not just going to affect, oh, my lights don't come on at night or I can't drive, but that's also, I can't drive to go visit a sick person or visit a sick relative or get to work. Or it might affect bigger industries like hospitals or clinics where you can't get the health care you need if they have to control their energy. And
well, yeah, I mean, just think of all the food in your freezer spoiling, right?
Yes.
And that's a real possibility. I mean, a winter blackout in that respect wouldn't be as bad because we live in the world's largest outdoor freezer in the wintertime. But that's a really dangerous thing. Like we saw what happened in Texas when they had their blackout, and one of the reasons they had that blackout was they expected the wind to only produce about 24% of its potential output, right? So they had low expectations going into that storm, but there were some points where it was only producing 2% of its potential output, right? So it's just too unreliable to fuel a system that requires, that teeter-totter to be in perfect balance every second of every day.
Yeah.
And that's essentially what they're forcing on us.
And it looks like there was another bill, and I call it the ominous bill, but the omnibus bill.
Yeah.
That Waltz was signing in, or he was getting ready to sign in.
Yeah, they're going to sign all of it eventually here in the next few days.
And that's going to force the EV car rule, correct?
Yeah, so a few years ago now, he initiated a rule that would force us to mandate a certain number of electric vehicles on dealership lots. That's a little different than the omnibus bill. So there are a few different provisions of the omnibus bill that are meant to basically incentivize people to get into electric vehicles, right? One of them allows utility companies like Xcel Energy to charge all of us more to build the EV charging stations that people will use. And I think that that's totally wrong. I mean, I'm so against that because like I did not grow up in a wealthy family. Like we were low income, right? So the idea that you're going to charge families like mine that were already struggling to get by more so you can build an electric vehicle charging station that somebody who can afford a Tesla is basically going to benefit from more than anyone else is absolutely wrong. I call it trickle-down environmentalism, where you have the DFL, or liberals, have become so metro-focused, right? They've forgotten their farmer labor roots, right? Which is why some people don't like to call them the DFL anymore, right?
The Democrats.
Yeah, so they're really obsessed with pleasing this constituency that's increasingly worried about problems that are really first world problems, and I see climate change as that, right? Like, I think that humans are having an impact on the planet, and CO2 emissions are part of that, right? But it's a really big difference of what do you do in order to stop that, and is it worth it? And essentially, they're willing to tear down all modern industrial civilization in order to get there. But yeah, so we're all going to be paying higher electric bills in order to fund electric vehicle charging infrastructure. We're paying higher taxes. Basically, they spent the whole $17 billion surplus, right?
Gone.
Yeah, and part of that goes to electric vehicle subsidies, so up to $2,500 for new electric vehicles. And that's on top of, I believe, a $7,500 federal tax credit that people can get. So if you're affluent and you have $10,000 in tax liabilities that you want to erase, go ahead, like saddle up to the public trough and buy yourself an EV. But it's such a status symbol thing, though, and that's really another thing that bothers me. I drive a 2011 Honda CR-V, so like it is not a classy vehicle by any stretch, but it gets me where I need to go. And the liberal base is just become kind of this affluent group of people that cares more about perceptions than they care about the impacts of their policies and on the people they pretend to care about, like low-income people, minority communities. Like it's kind of the equivalent. Like they like to mock conservatives for saying thoughts and prayers, but that's exactly what they're doing when they talk about, oh, these policies are going to help low-income people. Like, how? You're ladling money into your own pocket.
And that's what it's always been, is, you know, Excel's getting rich off of this, other people. You know, I drive a Toyota. Until recently, I had a Buick for 20 years, and then finally I had to get a new car, but it's still 2016.
Exactly.
So Toyota Corolla, not the Prius, but, you know.
Yeah, the Prius is a decent car,
it
right?
Is.
Like, I think, and that's another thing, right? So there's this kind of like absolutism that's infected the left in their environmentalist pursuits, right? Like they are not willing to let good exist. They want perfect, and they're willing to squash any amount of improvement or incremental improvement along the way in order to get there. There's a lot of research out there that suggests that when people do buy an electric car, it's usually their second or third vehicle. So the way that it works, if you have a household and you have one car, that tends to get driven the most. If you have a second car, it gets driven less. Because if you're going somewhere with your spouse or significant other, you don't take separate cars, right? So by the time you get to the third car, maybe that first car is driving 10,000 miles a year, let's just say, for instance, right? The third car, which is the electric vehicle generally, only goes like 2,000 or 3,000 miles a year, right? So instead of incentivizing people to buy electric vehicles, which are not a one-to-one substitute for the reliability and the range that you get for internal combustion engine, if you had a hybrid like a Prius or even a plug-in hybrid, like you could have a one-for-one replacement of that the internal combustion engine vehicle, and you would reduce emissions. But they're totally against that incremental progress, and that's why they're against nuclear too.
And now, are there ways that we can go green? I always like to look at the market way of going green versus forcing, versus how can companies, individuals look to making good changes for the environment?
Yeah, so, and that's a really great question. The hybrid vehicles instead of electric vehicles, I think or fully electric vehicles, right, would be a good way to make that incremental progress, right? So one of the things that I don't think many people have a good appreciation for is just how long it takes to transition different forms of energy, right? So The first gasoline and diesel powered tractors were invented in like the 1880s or the 1890s, and it's interesting that the draft horse, the amount of them in service peaked in the 1920s, right? So it wasn't something that was overnight. So you had this huge increase in draft horses, and then by 1960, the United States Department of Agriculture wasn't even like taking tabs or counting how many there were in service, because it was like my grandpa Phil, who still liked raking hay with his horse instead, right? So it's going to take a really long time, and we need to be cognizant of that. And so I do think that nuclear power should be the easy, common sense consensus technology, right? So we have these coal plants in these communities that have been energy communities for a really long time. The tax base is the coal plant, like most of the jobs in town are the coal plant. It funds the schools, it funds the hospital, right? And you could replace that coal plant with a new nuclear power plant. And those nuclear plants run for 80 years, right?
They
so
do,
it is
yeah.
a generational opportunity to invest in infrastructure in these areas. Instead, what Excel is doing is they're building all these solar facilities, and you'll be lucky if the solar panels last for 25 years, and then you need to spend all that money again. And even when they're like lasting or their operational life, they're still only working 18% of the time, when a nuclear plant would be producing 95% of its potential output, right?
And there's still mining involved with solar panels,
yes,
to my knowledge.
Yes, and slavery.
That
Let's
too.
talk about the slavery.
Yeah.
I think that the environment is such an emotional issue for people. They see it as like a way to signal how good they are, right? That's why
Yep.
people buy Teslas, and they like, I have solar panels on my roof. I can't be a bad person.
I can go green.
Yes,
you know,
exactly.
Yeah. Now I've made gone vegetarian in my own life, but I
Yeah.
don't do it to pride. It's just my own thing.
Yeah,
so.
and that's perfectly fine.
Yeah.
As a farm kid, I will forgive you for being a vegetarian. But the solar panels, the vast majority of the components are made in China, and they're made in the western province of China called Xinjiang.
Oh.
And that's where they have all the Muslim minority Uyghurs enslaved, and they're literally enslaved. They call it forced labor.
Of course.
Because like for some reason we need to think of a nicer way to say slavery.
Yeah.
I don't get it. It's slavery for all intents and purposes. And they're making these solar panel components in factories powered by coal, right? And then we buy these, and the low information voter that tends to think that these are a good idea, they don't know that they're essentially buying Confederate cotton and they're putting it on their roof, right? So that's one of the things that we want to do at American Experiment, is really educate the public about that. And people have this inflated sense of self-worth as a result of their like support for green energy, right? Like that's just part of it. That's like, it's an emotional good, and we want to kind of take that away from them, right? We're like, how is this an emotional good? How is this showing that you're a good person if you're supporting a product that's 80% made with slavery, right?
Exactly.
Like, you need to reevaluate your life choices, and fortunately, like, you don't need to give up your concerns about emissions in order to do that. You can support nuclear power instead, which is a better source of energy anyway. So yeah, it's having quite a few fun ideas planned for the foreseeable future.
That sounds great. And like you said, forced labor. I mean, that's like the soft way of calling it slavery. It just
Yeah.
sounds so.
I forget which Marvel movie it was, but Jeff Goldblum was one of the people, and is something along the way. He was going to say, "All right, go get the slaves."
Thor.
Yes.
I just watched that movie.
Yeah, and it's like, I mean, the prisoners with jobs, right? And it's just like, oh man, that was such a scathing indictment of the way that we kind of use language to paper over kind of some of the atrocities that are, involved in this energy transition that we keep hearing about.
What's really going on when
Yeah.
people are making things, when people are picking our plants or harvesting, or what's really going on with some of
Yep.
those issues, pulling back the curtains and saying, this is what's really happening behind the scenes.
Yeah, absolutely. And the cobalt that goes in the electric vehicle batteries, 55% of that comes from the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which
Yes.
is neither democratic nor a republic. But you have up to 40,000 kids mining cobalt by hand. And I was reading this book. I'm still reading it. It takes me a long time to read books. I'm better at audiobooks than real books. But it's called Cobalt Red.
Okay.
And it talks about the conditions that these kids are facing in the mines. So you'll have kids that are digging a tunnel, and the tunnel collapses, and nobody ever sees them again, right? So the mom has to walk over this ground that she knows her kid is buried underneath. And that's just part of what goes into the, and that's all the smart devices that we have, right? So that's my cell phone, my laptop, but you need about 100 times more cobalt for an electric vehicle battery than you do for those smaller consumer electronics. And we could be mining this stuff in Minnesota. Minnesota has the largest cobalt deposits in the entire country, but the Biden administration has taken steps to say, no, we're not going to let you mine here, right? And the Walz administration has also slow played the mining permits for the North Met project. So, all of these metals and minerals that, I won't say all, many of the metals and minerals that we need for the batteries, the solar panels, the wind turbines, could be mined in northern Minnesota, and we just aren't doing it because of environmental concerns. So it's total hypocrisy on their part, and I do think that there is beginning to be more acceptance of mining as a result of people understanding look, it's got to come from somewhere.
And like you said, it can bring jobs, it can build communities.
Oh yeah.
I know we could go on and on about this topic forever, but what can our viewers do as they're watching this? We kind of talk about the doom that's happening at the Capitol. What can viewers do to maybe start turning the tides here?
Yeah, check out our website at americanexperiment.org. We're always looking for new readers, and we have a quarterly magazine called Thinking Minnesota. It goes out to over 100,000 households. And it's free, right? So you can't beat the price. Sign up your friends, sign up your enemies, I tell people, and hopefully we can get the word out that way. Also, just reach out to your legislators. Say, hey, thank you for fighting the blackout bill, because we had a petition at American Experiment that went out to, we sent over 37,000 emails. So one to state rep, one to a senator, and one to Governor Walz. Just say, hey, thank you for standing up against the blackout bill. Let's try to get some nuclear power stuff passed. Let's try to repeal the worst parts of this moratorium, and let's have a plan to say, look, these coal plants that we have could run for another 10, 20 years. Let's use them, right? I drive a 2011 car for a reason, right? Because I can still use it, right? It's stupid to throw away a perfectly good asset. And let's have a long-term plan to build a new nuclear power plant in those areas and keep that money in those communities. Let's do right by these communities that have coal plants, and we can also, provide all the zero emissions energy that you could ever want, right? So that way you won't have to ask people, please don't charge your electric vehicle right now, the sun is going down.
Yeah, or please don't charge your phone, or however, please don't turn on your lights or turn on your stove.
Don't run your dishwasher, don't run your dryer, and that's the most regressive part about all of this. If you're a single income parent or single income family and you're getting off from work and it just happens to be 5 p.m. when the electricity prices are skyrocketing and they're saying don't do it, you don't have a choice.
Exactly.
Right? So,
well, I'm going to stop you there,
do
but
it.
Thank you so much for being on our show.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you for joining us on Republican Roundtable once again, and learning about policy and energy and environment from Isaac Orr. It was a great talk, and I hope you enjoyed it. Till next time.